Today on CityCast Denver. Back in the early 90s, Colorado wasn't really known for craft beer. But then along came New Belgium Brewing and Fat Tire. It was an iconic amber ale that attracted fans all over the world. But this week, 32 years later, New Belgium is giving Fat Tire a whole new look and a whole new taste. The Colorado beer man himself, Jonathan Shikes of the Denver Post, is on today to explain why the Fort Collins Brewery is rebranding and reformulating their flagship beer. Today is Thursday, January 19th, 2023. I'm Bree Davies, and this is CityCast Denver. Jonathan Shikes, welcome back to CityCast Denver.
Thanks, Bree. Thanks for having me on.
Jonathan, I want to start by talking about how Fat Tire became such a big deal for the beer community here. Why does Fat Tire matter?
So Fat Tire first came out in 1991, and they, Kim Jordan, who co-founded the brewery, she would go around selling. She would load up her car and she would go around selling beer individually to liquor stores because you could do that in Colorado, and putting it on tap in Denver. And it was a phenomenon. Breweries copied it all over the place in the 90s. Everybody wanted to make a red or an amber ale. And over the years, it gained a huge amount of cachet. I remember in 2010, there was a bar in maybe in Manhattan or maybe in Brooklyn, and they got Fat Tire, and people just went bananas. And I'm not sure if they had it legally or not. They may have just bought it themselves and brought it in, or maybe they got a one-time permit, but it was a huge deal. And New Belgium, kind of like Coors, didn't sell east of the Mississippi for until the 80s. New Belgium didn't sell Fat Tire in a whole lot of states until about 2016, 2017.
Oh, wow. So that 2010 moment in New York was this was like some underground. This was something you literally could not get.
Right. Yeah. It was underground. It was a big deal. And they finally went to all 50 states after they opened their second big brewing facility on the East Coast. And, I think by the time that happened, Fat Tire had become, because there were so many breweries, Fat Tire had become sort of, it sort of became something for people to kick. It's a gateway beer to craft breweries. If you're making the switch from Old Milwaukee to IPAs, you're going to go through Fat Tire first. And so, people like to disparage it, but it was a huge deal for a couple of decades.
And so that's why the big announcement from New Belgium this week was so surprising. Can you explain exactly what is changing about Fat Tire?
So they announced this week that they were going to change the recipe, change the way the beer looked, change all of its branding. And it's essentially a different beer. And that's a big deal, I think, for a lot of people who stayed in the gateway, right? They stuck with Fat Tire and they loved it. And it's a big deal from a beer history standpoint because of how important Fat Tire was. But they're not the only ones to totally change a recipe and keep a name, but they're the biggest.
Did that surprise you at all? Because the Fat Tire you're describing and sort of this ubiquity that I know it for, it seems precarious to make a big change to a flagship beer.
Yeah, it's an interesting decision. It's got to be purely a business decision. Everybody's heard of Fat Tire, so they can't, they want to keep the name, but I guess it's not selling very well. I read on the trade beer blog, Good Beer Hunting, that, sales are down over the last 5-6 years by 50% across the country, I think. So
wow.
People are not buying it anymore. Well, lots of people are still buying it, but not nearly enough. And so they want people to buy it, and they've got the name already, and now they're trying to tie this low carbon footprint story to it. And they're trying to turn it into, or they have turned it into, a much lighter beer, which is something that a lot of people, I guess, like.
You say, I guess, is that sort of the trend or the movement right now in craft beer to go towards the lighter styles?
Craft beer was all about, making bigger and bigger IPAs and richer beers. And then they started leaning back in toward lagers 7 or 8 years ago, and lighter, because lagers are typically lighter, but lighter styles. A lot of people loved going to their local brewery, but they didn't want an IPA. They didn't want a big rich beer. They wanted something that tasted not too much different than the mass produced beers. So that is a big trend that's happened over the last few years. And there are a lot of people who like those really light beers, which is what Fat Tire had become, and in some ways was really light compared to the others. But what I've heard they turned it into is almost like a blonde ale, which is doesn't have a huge amount of flavor and is easy drinking. A lot of people love that, and a lot of people don't.
I know. You say easy drinking, and I'm like, oh yes, that's why I only drank light beers when I did drink, because you could just shotgun a few in a row and it wasn't too heavy. But what I'm kind of wondering is, like, I think about Coors, and it's an iconic beer known all over the world from Colorado. Why do you think Fat Tire couldn't make it to that step and just become an iconic beer for what it is, that original recipe, across the world?
Well, I don't know. I mean, across the world, people probably have heard of it. And I'm sure they did export it. Probably. I don't know if they still do or not. But it was an iconic beer. It was for a long time. It just was not able to hold on to what it was. It could be that people were just interested in other flavors, and Fat Tire is just always there, and your eyes go over it when you're in the liquor store or when you see it on a menu. And you say, oh, yeah, well, there's Fat Tire. But what else what else have they got? What else is new? And I think a lot of the big flagship brands for a lot of these old legacy breweries, as they call them, the ones that have been around for a while, have gone through the same thing where these flagship beers just don't sell like they did.
Yeah, and I'm thinking about the person who's like, looks at a menu like that and goes, well, I'll just have a Coors. But maybe Fat Tire's sort of in this limbo of like, it's not the level of like, your grandpa will drink this, but it's also not this like hyper specific craft beer. It's kind of in between. Maybe that's part of its problem.
Yeah, I mean, I think you might be right. That's its thing. It's in between.
This episode is brought to you by the How to Buy a Home podcast. Okay, so I know that it feels like a house around $500,000 being the median home price is wild for Denver, but it's actually much better than it was like a year ago. So I just don't want that to deter folks. It's not as scary as it seems. That's why I keep recommending the How to Buy a Home podcast. Host David Sidoni has been the undisputed first-time homebuyer authority since 2005. His How to Buy a Home podcast has helped so many listeners close on houses they thought were impossible, even as things went nuts with the housing market in the last couple of years. David can guide you through next steps that are right for you, whether you're planning to buy a home now or 5 years from now. He can even connect you with a great realtor right here in Denver that works with first-time homebuyers and actually cares about you. Plus, he just released his first-time homebuyer starter kit at howtobuyahome.com. It's a free resource thousands of people have already taken advantage of with all the knowledge you need to buy your first home. Start planning today at howtobuyahome.com and make this the last year you rent. Find How to Buy a Home on YouTube and wherever you listen to podcasts. So you've talked about sort of changing tastes in the industry, also seeing this as maybe a business decision. What do you think this move for Fat Tire or the Fat Tire story says about the state of craft beer right now?
I think breweries, especially the big ones, are willing to do whatever it takes to stay in business right now. They have to. Small, independently owned craft breweries are doing what they need to do. Craft beer is interesting because it's always held itself to a little bit of a different standard than maybe other businesses in order to stick to its kind of the unusual ethos around it. And it's people really want authenticity. And I think that's part of what sells about craft beer. The bigger companies that aren't independently owned will do whatever they need to do. They also rely somewhat on authenticity, but New Belgium is owned by a company called Little Lion right now, which is in turn owned by Kirin, which is a huge Japanese conglomerate.
Yeah, and so that's what I want to talk about too. Is I'm thinking about the story you shared with me about how the owners early on with New Belgium were like independent, selling this beer on their own, and then in 2013 the employees bought out those owners, and now, like you said, they're owned by Little Lion. Does this changing ownership structure of New Belgium have anything to do with the kinds of beers they decide to make and sell?
That's a good question. Right now, the beers they are known for are all IPAs. they have this Voodoo Ranger juggernaut, and it's some of the top selling in the craft category. It's just they're some of the top selling beers in the U.S. And I think that Little Lion probably gives New Belgium a decent amount of leeway because they still produce a lot of niche beers, sours, and small batch beers and that kind of thing. But if something is a huge player and it's not making money, they're going to switch it up. And I think they would do that even if they were still independently owned, I have a feeling.
So I don't know if this is an adequate comparison, but because it is a little different in that beer tastes change. There's so many types of beers, but I can't help but think changing the basic formulation of something feels a little bit like the sort of the dangerous proposition that was like New Coke in the 80s, right? When Coca-Cola was like, we're changing the flavor of the thing that you love. Is this not the same thing? Do you think it's because beer is just tastes do change with beer that they felt safe in making this massive change to a flagship brand?
I don't know if they felt safe. They obviously felt like they needed to do something, but I do agree. It is like New Coke, and we know what happened to New Coke. They went back to old Coke. Right. Some of it is perception, and some of it is the real flavor. I mean, if you don't tell anyone you're changing something, probably half the people won't notice, and the other half will. In this case, they're obviously telling everybody, but I don't know if you stuck around for Fat Tire all these years, then you stuck around because you liked the way it tasted. So,
right.
I mean, you didn't stick around because you liked the name, so I'm just not sure. I'm just not sure how it's going to work for them. I'm not a business person, so I could be very wrong.
You're just a person that loves beer and knows a lot about it.
Yeah. To me, it seemed like a really strange decision.
Well, it'll be interesting to see how it goes, what beer drinkers think, what sort of the continued evolution of the industry is. But I have to ask, I feel from this conversation that maybe you have not tasted the new Fat Tire because it's like it literally just rolling out. But have you tasted the new Fat Tire yet?
So they sent me a can of it early. They embargoed it. Which means you can't talk about. You agree if you agree to getting the can in the mail, then you can't talk about it till a certain date. So we at the Denver Post we agreed to not talk about it until a certain date. And Teeny Ricciardi, who writes about beer at the Post, she tried it, and she was not a huge fan. She has been trained in beer tasting. I have not tried it because I am doing dry January.
Oh,
so. It's the first time I've ever done dry January. So awkward, but I have the can sitting in my fridge and I'm going to try it. Teeny wasn't a fan. And, I read Axios this morning, John Frank, who's also
another
a terrific beer taster.
Yeah.
Also not a fan. He said it tasted like sweet cereal, a lot lighter. Did not have the kind of the rich malty flavor that the old Fat Tire had.
Interesting. Well, you're going to have to follow up with us on what you thought. Well, Jonathan Shikes, thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thanks as always for having me on.
And here's what else Denverites are talking about: gun control. With Democrats in control at the legislature, there's a lot of discussion this session on expanding the state's red flag law, new age limits for firearm purchases, and longer waiting periods. 9 News reports that the draft of one bill, the quote, Mass Shooting Prevention Act of 2023, includes a ban on the buying, selling, or possession of assault weapons. We'll definitely be watching this as the conversation evolves. And finally, more payouts for police violence. Denverite reports that this week, City Council approved a $160,000 settlement for a protester who was shot with pepper balls by Denver police during the George Floyd uprisings in 2020. This comes after Council signed off on a $325,000 settlement in a similar case and follows several years of high payouts by the city of Denver for police brutality cases. Oh, and before we go, we're still talking tacos, like street tacos. What's your fave spot? Is it a strip mall takeout restaurant nobody knows about? Is it a taco truck you find yourself on the hunt for every week? Let us know the purveyors of the best street tacos in the metro area by calling our taco hotline at 720-500-5418. Leave us a voicemail with your name, neighborhood, and street taco recommendation, and you might hear it on our next food battle. That number again is 720-500-5418. That's all for today here on CityCast Denver. If you enjoyed the show, why not take a minute to tell the owners of Taco Celine about us next time you see them? Rate the show wherever you get your podcasts and subscribe to our morning newsletter, Hey Denver, by texting Denver to 66866. We'll be back tomorrow morning with more news from around the city. See you later. I don't want this to sound creepy, like I'm still a raging alcoholic, but like ever since Jonathan was talking about like the sweetness of the beer, I've been thinking about, there used to be this place called the Climax Lounge that was the Raven, and before that I'm sure it was many other amazing things. I don't know what it is now. It's on Welton Street, but anyway, it was a reckless place in that they served demi pitchers, like half pitchers of beer. There were these tiny pitchers and they just gave them to you, like without a cup. So you just like were wandering around a bar drinking a half pitcher. But they served Budweiser out of the tap, and I don't think they ever cleaned the taps, but it tasted like sweet, like beer. No Budweiser anywhere else. It was like the place I got Budweiser in a demi pitcher. It's so crazy. Now that I think about it, I'm like, that's crazy to be serving people that much beer. But